You're listening to a Rock Candy podcast.
This is our podcast. We're Andrew and John. We talk a long time. This is our theme song. This is our theme song. This is MacPod, yeah, for life.
Coming to you from Magnified Studios, Magnified Pod presents Pods from the Penalty Box, a nostalgic sampling of skate punk albums from the 90s Christian alternative scene. Join us in the pit. I'm Andrew.
I'm John.
And this is our podcast. And this is our food line. You know, we're not doing Goaty Hook anymore, but this is still our food line.
I forgot for a second, but I'm glad you didn't.
How can you forget?
Sorry. Got a lot going on.
How dare you?
Never forget that this is our food line.
So today on the pod, we have three amazing guests, Jake Dockter, Krispin Mayfield, and Joel Harrison. And we're going to be talking the Christian punk scene. We're going to be talking philosophy. We're going to be talking psychology. We're going to be talking just a lot of amazing stuff that we have touched on throughout our pod history, but having kind of like a panel discussion with people who have experience in these fields.
Yes. It's an impressive array of panelists.
Talking politics, schmolitics.
That's right.
It's too confusing, but we'll get it all straightened out.
Should we just move straight into it?
Yeah, I think we should just jump right into it. Let's take a quick ad break from one of our contemporaries on the Rock Candy Network, and then we'll get into our conversation with our dudes.
I'm Avery Smith, and I'm here to invite you to Blessed Are the Binary Breakers, a multi-faith podcast of transgender stories. Whatever your own relationship to gender and spirituality may be, you will find yourself enriched by the stories shared by my guests, who so far have ranged in religion from Christian and pagan to Jewish, Sikh, atheist, and beyond, and have hailed from the US, Chile, Poland, Australia, and more. Tune in wherever you get your podcasts, or read along with episode transcripts by visiting blessedarethebinarybreakers.com. See you there.
John, today on Magnified Pod, we have three guests, and it has indeed been a while since we've had a three guest roster on the pod. We have Jake Dockter, writer and activist, former tour manager for Tooth and Nail. We have Krispin Mayfield, therapist, host of the podcast Prophetic Imagination Station and Attached to the Invisible, and author of forthcoming book Attached to God, and Professor Joel Harrison, associate professor of religion at Northern Virginia Community College, and also author of forthcoming book Palms of Victory, Crowns of Glory, Evangelical Political Identity, and Underground Christian Punk. Everybody, welcome to Magnified Pod.
It's great to be here.
Thanks for coming, everybody. We're excited about this prestigious panel.
Yeah, I think
like
this
a
is
Zoom party.
I know, right? Well, John and I typically have beverages, so that it is usually a party of sorts.
Yeah.
I feel like this is the first of a kind of an episode for us, that usually when we've had multiple guests on, it's talking about kind of a single thing, but having a variety of guests from kind of a similar scene, but like from different careers and trajectories. And it does feel more like a panel than it does one of our regular episodes. So I'm excited to see kind of where this whole conversation goes.
Definitely. And each of you have something to say about sort of the general focus of our conversation together today, which is sort of the different impacts of the scene that we cover on the show. You know, the alternative and punk Christian scene of the 90s and early 2000s shaped a lot of people in a lot of ways. And each of you have touched on different expressions of that. But we kind of had this idea of, you know, focusing on the sort of the social identity, the ways that the scene has shaped people in that way, the political identity, and then sort of the psychological and spiritual shaping that the scene can do. And each of you can speak to those things, but maybe we'll start by giving folks just a little bit of background about each of you for listeners, and sort of how the scene we cover on the show shaped the work you do now. Jake, if you want to start off.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I'm 41. And so like, you know, it was like started high school in 1994, graduated in 98. So it was like coming into music right around the time that Tooth and Nail and kind of all of this alternative Christian music was also like blossoming. And it's also like the pre-internet days. So like was getting the like Tooth and Nail mail order catalog, dreaming about finally getting a car and going to Seattle. Wishing that I would have a car to be able to go to Tom Fest, you know, but like talking about all that stuff, having friends go and bring everything back. I grew up in the Central Valley of California, like kind of close enough to everything, but also like a million miles away when you're poor and don't have a car.
Sure.
Right.
But like grew up very evangelical, very involved in the church. So like the first album, like I remember like a distinct memory. I have no idea what year. That'll blow the punchline, but like anyways, like remember being like 9 or 10 and like just begging my parents for the Carmen cassette tape for Christmas.
Of course.
And then getting it, and then like, but then immediately remember like discovering other stuff and leaving that all behind pretty quickly, and got into like Mad at the World and Prayer Chain and all of this sort of stuff, and then had my world just like totally changed and opened. And you know, like I'm lucky enough to have grown up in the like pre-internet phase of like crate digging, mail order catalogs. You get your hands on something and just like read all of the liner notes.
Yeah.
And it like took so much work to try to find this stuff. And I think for me, that was probably like one of the more formative parts of like the scene in the world, was that like it took a lot of work to be into it. And like you would like pour over liner notes and like learn, you know, like the names of people who appeared, and then you would see them pop up on another album, and you were like connecting the dots and like decoding this weird world that was like seemed so far away, you know?
For sure.
It seems light years away from Spotify algorithms telling you like what you might enjoy. Like we've talked about this on the pod a lot, that if it wasn't at your local Christian bookstore, or you didn't see it, like you didn't go to a show, then it just kind of didn't exist. Like there wasn't a way for you to get your hands on it if you like, unless you were getting a mail order catalog and you could find it. There just wasn't, you couldn't just go someplace and listen to every album. You had to find it. And so stumbling,
but there was like this like, there was like this like black market, you know, of like people trading behind the scenes, or you'd borrow it, or they'd make you a mixtape, and then you'd be like, you know, you'd borrow their album and you'd read through all the liner notes, and like we'd share with the older friend, or there'd be like my friend's dad owned the Christian bookstore. He was a little bit older and he could like special order stuff for us that he wasn't supposed to. And it was all like felt very clandestine, you know, but it was still like, we weren't ordering like Bad Religion or like Misfits records. You know,
Sure.
they're still like it was like on the back part of the Tooth and Nail catalog or something that was like maybe slightly a little bit edgy, but like it still felt like you'd have to be like, hey, I ordered that thing, wink, wink, and then you'd be like, oh yeah, I've got it behind the counter. You know,
It's like whispering and paper bags and stuff.
Well, and I was thinking too about the like going to shows and having like all those just burned CDs of like albums that like you would never be able to find now, you know,
Right.
like
Yeah.
you couldn't find them then. Like maybe there was like a very dark HTML website and all the files were in like .wma or something, you know?
Yeah.
Yes, for sure.
just been trying to download all of those insiders live recordings.
We need them. Or maybe they were, you know, mislabeled and you wanted to get MXPX and you got Barbie Girl or whatever, the famous the files were always misnamed on those downloading sites. Krispin, do you want to share a bit about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because I am 6 years younger than Jake, which is really not that much younger, and we are friends in real life. But in that time of history, like that is like an eternity from like, you know, 95 to 2001. Like if we're talking about, you know, that was really when I stepped into more alternative Christian music. But I'm a therapist. I've been doing a podcast about Christian hardcore, mostly solid state bands, and basically like looking at the lyrics and looking at those lyrics as like an entry point into understanding the psychology of evangelicalism, because they didn't really care as long as you didn't talk about sex or drugs. You could say whatever you wanted. You could say these like horrible like things, you know, like I hate myself. And I don't know if that's because that like fits that theology or if it's because they couldn't tell what you were saying, maybe both. But you know, there's a lot there, and it was very serious in the way that like MXPX wasn't, right? And so basically I've just used that as a launching pad to talk about evangelical, the experience of growing up evangelical. Also, I was a missionary kid, and so I did go to some shows sometimes, but my experience was mostly downloading things on the internet because it was, you know, 2001, 2002. And onward. So just listening to a lot of things on my, you know, CD Walkman. So.
Yep. Yeah. One of the things we've talked a lot about. So this season on our show, we're doing the first genre season we've done. You know, we did MXPX and then 5 Iron, and now we're doing skate punk. And so we're covering a bunch of different bands. And it's the first time that we've delved into some of these evangelical sort of mindsets that these kids were in some of these bands, and we so often cover like, man, these guys are so hard on themselves and they're just teenagers, and it's like, you're doing okay, buddy, you're not the worst, but like
what is it that you did when you were 16 or 17 years old that makes you such a monster that you were just so terrible?
Or even 14, like in the case of Slick Shoes. Slick Shoes' first record, like it's like, dude, you were like maybe 13 when you wrote these songs. How could you be so terrible?
Ryan was like, a lot of those early records were just a lot of how terrible he was, and a lot of the you know, struggling with friendships and that sort of stuff, which makes sense, tracks for that age. But and then you gotta, you know, sprinkle in all the abortion songs throughout the scene, you know, and certainly that is also the case. Crispin, I'd be interested to, as we've covered almost every band that we've covered this season has had an abortion song or an abortion adjacent song. And I've got to imagine that has also come up quite a bit in the more hardcore scene and other bands that you've covered.
That's actually like a good, like, I feel like I would assume old school, like older school Christian hardcore. I know Under Oath on their first album had this this ridiculous, like right in line, right? It's like he screams like, you should have thought about the baby before you had sex, like in this like high-pitched voice, or like
very nuanced
scream, right? Yeah. But I did, like I definitely was like solid state years, like 99 going back to like 99 and forward, where like there was a lot of like it was way more poetic in a way and way less like in your face. I think I think Joel, you've been looking at this. I've been looking at like what was important to me when I was like 17. You've been looking at like the broader scope of all this, so you might have a different insight.
Joel, do you want to tell us about yourself?
Yeah, so I feel like my experience is maybe slightly different. That's something that I've noticed as I've been doing research for this book and conducting interviews with people. So I grew up in an evangelical environment. My parents are both evangelicals, but it was really not that strict. Like I was allowed to listen to secular music. I never once remember my parents saying, like, you can't do this, or you can't listen to this, you can't watch this. I remember my mom being like a little bit like unsure of us, like watching The Simpsons when I was like 9 years old or something, but yeah, I was able to listen to whatever music I wanted to. And so, the difference, I guess, that made for me, I don't know. I mean, the Christian scene maybe didn't play as huge of a role in my sort of philosophical or spiritual development as it did for other people. I mean, it definitely did play a role, but I just, I didn't have the experience of like, oh, I can only buy music from the Christian bookstore, or I can, that was sort of a newish thing to me when I started researching this book last year, to encounter people who are like, oh yeah, my parents, it was like I was pulling a fast one on them, getting this music from the Christian bookstore, because they didn't know that it was just like screaming, or that it was like punk or something like that, yeah, so I grew up in Southern California in around the same time as Jake. I'm 38, almost 39. So I remember my youth pastor handed me a copy of Teenage Politics when I was in 7th grade.
Hell yeah.
Because I would not shut up about Green Day. And he was like, dude, you have to stop talking about Green Day. Here, listen to this. And I remember thinking like, oh my God, like this sounds like Green Day. And actually, I maybe like MXPX a little bit better than Green Day. And then I just kind of never looked back. And that, sort of opened up a world of like music that isn't on the radio. So my first sort of like introduction to underground music was through the Christian music scene. And then, I had a friend who went to a different church who, there's an older like college age leader who would take us to shows. Like he took us to this thing at Point Loma College called Lollapalooza, where all of these huge Christian bands like Five Iron and the Supertones, and I remember thinking it was just the crazy, I was 15, thought it was the craziest thing ever. And then from there kind of started getting into other stuff. So like kind of through high school and college, I was both involved in the quote unquote secular, underground scene, as well as Christian music. Pasadena, where I kind of grew up, still has this sort of like famous, infamous church venue called the No Future Cafe, where like tons of wannabe sort of Christian bands would get their start, or try to get their start. It was called No Future because everybody who played there had no future in the music industry. But it was like a cool, like, that was like our local scene or whatever. And then, so in terms of, I guess, everything else, I'm a professor at a community college. My PhD is in religious studies from Northwestern, and my dissertation was, without getting too like in the weeds here, was basically just about theology and culture, and how does theology sort of maintain its claim to authority and being sort of universal and unchanging, even as it is responding to culture and actually changing over time, right? So this is like a big problem in Christian theology throughout history, and so that kind of in thinking about that, and during the pandemic, just like kind of revisiting some of this music, I started thinking, like, has anybody written like a book about this from an academic perspective? And there are a few like sociologists and so forth who've written things, but nobody's, as far as I know, done it from like a philosophy of religion or theology or social philosophy kind of perspective. So I'm sort of interested in this reciprocal relationship, I guess, between religious identity and culture, and the way that those things sort of shape and affect each other.
Sure. Yeah. Maybe then having you kick things off by sort of delving a bit more into that would be a good way to go. I mean, you've mentioned that some of your academic focus has been on this idea of sort of authenticity that was really emphasized within the scene. That there was this push to sort of counter the secular alternative scene in some aspects of that world. So like that led to this sort of glorification of apolitical being the goal. Can you talk a bit about that, or sort of what your book emphasizes?
Right. Yeah. So I think that, like, kind of in the broadest strokes, when I tell people who are not familiar with this at all that I'm writing a book on Christian punk, their immediate thought is, well, that is like an oxymoron. Like those two words don't go together. What does that mean? And if you spend any time, I've spent some time in like, Facebook groups that are like fan groups for like, secular punk scenes and stuff. And everybody is always, dumping on Christian punk. Like nobody takes it seriously or whatever. But, I think that from the punk perspective, there's actually really nothing about Christianity that like precludes it from being part of the punk scene, because historically, what it meant to be authentically punk was just to express whatever your ideology was. And so you have this very wide range of ideological expressions of punk across the political spectrum. It is mostly leftist, but obviously we all know there are skinhead punks, and and then you also have bands like 108 who are Hare Krishnas, right? So you have Krishnacore, and you have straight edge and vegans and all of this stuff. So Christianity is not really like out of bounds there in that kind of world. So that part of it makes sense. I think, going the other way, right? Can punk be Christian? That's really where the tension for people in the scene like arose, right? There really was never a question of like, can Christianity fit within the punk ethos? I think like there's so much about punk aesthetics and the punk ethos that fits very well with certain especially contemporary understandings of Christianity. So the idea of authenticity for me, there's sort of multiple layers here, right? There's multiple ways we can talk about authenticity. We can talk about, whether or not Christian punk is an authentic form of music, right? Or is it just derivative trash like most of CCM? Everybody who grew up in a youth group knows those charts that say, if you like this secular band, then you'll love this Christian band. And I remember someone, a youth leader, telling me that I should stop listening to Nirvana and listen to DC Talks Jesus Freak instead. And even when I was like 11 or 12, I was like, bro, this sucks. This is straight up garbage. Like, this is not like Nirvana at all. What are you talking about? Like, it was so obviously like a pale imitation,
Yes.
like trying to copy, right? So, but I do think that there's a special window of time, and I don't really have a set dates on when this was, but there definitely was a special window of time for the Christian scene when it really just was people wanting to be in punk bands and just singing about what they knew. So like, for
July
example,
6th, 1997 to August 12th, 1999. That's your time frame.
Okay. I love
no,
it.
no, see, I would go back earlier than that, because like when I interviewed Billy Power for this book, he was like very, very clear, and he's been clear about this on his own podcast and in other interviews and stuff. But he's always been very clear that he just wanted to be in a punk band, right? He wanted to be, the Descendants or whoever, like whatever punk bands were cool, like that's what he wanted to be like. They didn't have in their mind, right, we're trying to be a Christian punk band. I mean, even Mark Solomon and the Crucified, like, yeah, they were very sort of outspoken, maybe a little too in your face at times, I guess. I mean, with a name like the Crucified and all that stuff about their Christianity, but they also, they have that song, I'm Not a Christian Punk, which makes it pretty clear, like, I don't want to be part of this label. So I think that there is a moment in time, a stretch of time, and maybe it's even like a decade or so, where these bands are really just being punk bands. Other bands like Crash Dog, Head Noise, like, even prior to Tooth and Nail, they're just trying to be punk bands, and they're just singing what they know, and that fits the punk ethos. And I think because Christianity is so pervasive in our culture, like, we tend to ascribe, like, I don't know how to put it, like certain special ways of lenses to view Christianity's engagement with culture, like it must be cannibalizing some other part of culture, which, to be fair, often is the case. But I do think that it's worth sort of drawing out the ways in which the scene was truly authentic in that regard, like with regard to the aesthetics. Now, with regard to the other parts of it, the politics and so forth, I do think eventually there emerged this attitude, like, the old folks or the traditionalists in my church reject me because I maybe want to dress a certain way, or I listen to this music, and like the worship director is not going to let me get up on Youth Sunday with my guitar and, with my band and play a bunch of punk songs, right? Because they don't like how it sounds. And they're telling me that it's not Christian. And then on the other side, the punks are telling me that I'm not punk. I mean, Bad and Evil's famous too punk for the Christians, too Christian for the punks thing. And that became a badge of honor. But what I'm trying to do is sort of, unpack exactly like why in terms of authenticity. And so, again, I don't want to get too in the weeds of like the philosophy, the philosophical sources here, but just as one example, probably the person most responsible for the popularization of the idea of authenticity in the West is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who's a French political philosopher. And for Rousseau, what it means to be an authentic self, right, is to be true to whatever's inside of you to the point of shame, right? So that you sort of openly embrace this idea that being authentic means that society is going to shame you for being authentic, right? It's this move in the 18th century, a rejection of just being a cog in society, that was understood as sincerity, right? To be sincere meant to be just do your part and disappear right into the machine of society. And Rousseau is saying, no, sincerity is wrong. and life killing. We need to be authentic. And so he talks a lot about masturbation and all this stuff, right, in his writing. And I think that element of shame is really crucial in a lot of different ways. And I think Crispin obviously can speak more to that than I can, all these different levels. But the level I'm interested in is the way that it comes to form an identity in relation to these poles, right? That as long as you are between the poles of the traditionalists and the secularists, or the secular punks, however you want to call it, that you can be assured that you are being an authentic Christian in some way, right? That that you are staying true to yourself because you sort of openly embrace the vitriol or whatever that people are going to heap on you. And then I'm sort of jumping a lot of argumentative steps here, but eventually I'll get to the point where I think that does manifest itself in politics. And I know you guys, some of you are in the labeled Facebook group, right? And occasionally a political argument will break out there, right?
Yes.
And there are lots of people, I think, who defend what I think are morally just, often more leftist positions. And you obviously have the conservative trolls, in there as well. But you also see groups of people who are like, come on, guys, Jesus wasn't a Democrat or a Republican, and that has also sort of come through in the interviews that I've done with some folks. It's not across the board, but I think that there is a sense in which this idea that you have to sort of rise above the poles of whatever partisan divide there is, right? And that's the marker, the identifying mark of being an authentic person, right?
Yeah, I wonder how. I mean, that partly seemed like a specific focus of that time within sort of evangelical culture. Like I'm sure that is still a thing. I know that that's still a thing that exists, that having that as sort of a point of pride. But I wonder if there was something about that time. We talk so much about this, like our parents may have been doing something theologically with us that was completely separate from what a pastor of a church was doing, but it was the youth group that was really like shaping us in the most significant ways. And so I wonder if there was this sort of 90s youth group moment that we talk a lot about on the show that aligned particularly with that idea of like it being a goal to sort of, you don't want to be at either extreme of these things. The goal is to be, like you said, like Jesus was not a Democrat or Republican. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true to a certain extent. I also worry a little bit about the some of the contemporary movements in sort of progressive-ish evangelicalism, like the deconstructionist thing, because sometimes what that feels like is like another way of saying like, this is my way of avoiding like landing on any like position as like affirmative. Like I can just say that I'm, deconstructing in a process of deconstruction, and then I never have to like align myself affirmatively with any political position because, I can just talk about how it's been deconstructed or something like that.
That's something that, when I went through my major deconstruction back in 2013, I mean, the whole for me, like I feel like what people need to do is, and this is something, Joel, that you'll, talking about philosophy, is defining terms. Like before you even like get to having a philosophical discussion, define the terms. And what are people talking about when they talk about deconstruction? And I think for a lot of people, it's probably going to mean something different. But for me, like I thought about it in sort of in a like in my mind, I'm I'm a very visual person, and so it's like I had to take all of the different things, take them apart, and sort of separate them out and work on them like in just different categories and work through that shit through therapy and
Sure.
over these last 8 years. So, but the important part for me is not just the deconstruction and working through the trauma and working through the philosophical, theological, and spiritual parts of what it is that I believe and how do I define different moral and ethical beliefs now that I'm, not just easily saying, oh, because Jesus, that's why, because Jesus,
Right.
like all that aside, like it's the reconstruction part that is the most important. You can't just constantly be in deconstruction. You can't stay in there because at some point you're just going to run out of stuff.
Right.
You need to,
totally.
you need to rebuild
Yeah.
that identity and reshape. And I'm sure this is like Crispin, there's probably some stuff in there that, that's familiar with, you're familiar with that, a lot of that, but like, the angry Andrew of 2013 is not who I am now because all of that work of the deconstruction and the reconstruction and it takes some time. And sometimes there are people that are, people coming out of different faith backgrounds, different churches have their trauma and their anger and they have, and they're right. They have their rights to be angry. There's reasons to be angry. There's reasons to be in that space. But staying there, there's more after that.
I was thinking to go in a different direction. Sorry to go back to this piece of like, what was it about that time with like Tooth and Nail for, for example, because I feel like it wasn't anywhere close to deconstruction. I think I was reflecting on my own experience of like, it was so cool that I could have this aesthetic, like musical aesthetic and otherwise, that looked so edgy. And I could be like, but this is like orthodox theology, right? There was like a point of pride around that. And that to me really parallels like some of the churches that I see like in Portland that I would call like Reformed churches in skinny jeans, right? Like Imago Dei. I'll name names. Imago Dei is a great example of that, right? Where it's like, oh, we're really edgy, we're really artistic, like we're, but like, but then you get to the core of what's behind it, and it's like, oh yeah, this actually was like planted out of I think a Baptist network, and that feels so true. And so I think looking at and then other churches in the Northwest that have been gotten some attention lately. But and actually like thinking about Mars Hill's connection with Tooth and Nail bands.
Yes.
Right. I think that explains a lot of where I was as a teenager, and then what I see in those churches now, which is like we're not actually doing any deconstruction, but we're putting a fresh slap of paint on it that looks different from the outside. And so I'm really curious, like then how that ties into that like apolitical identity. And I'm sure Jake, you have.
Oh yeah, no, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I'm sure Jake also has just thoughts on this at some point. Being also in these sorts of communities, or at least
completely
around.
No, I agree with you, Crispin. And like for me, like starting back in the scene, like Joel, I completely resonate with a lot of what you're saying, but there was also a group of us who like didn't care like it wasn't performative. It was just like this weird thing of like, in this space, I can explore more of who I am in a way that feels like safe, right? Like I remember being like finally being old enough. We had a friend who had a car and could drive. Actually, it was like our friend Julie's boyfriend, Bruce, who was slightly older. She was like, you know, he was 17, so he had a license in a car, and we're like, we can go to a show. Finally, we were able to just be like, we're going out, we're going to a show. We were at our friend's house. I have this like very vivid sense memory of just being like, we're going to get ready to go to the show. I was just like a nerdy little white evangelical kid who like knew that like I wanted to go outside of where I was, but didn't have the resources to do it. Right. Like didn't have the ability, was still like dependent upon my parents, didn't have my own money to buy my own clothes, you know, was like constrained.
Right.
And like we were at my friend's house, who's like a friend who I grew up with in church. Parents were like, that's fine, you're with Nick. We trust you. And we were just like, you know, we're going to go to a punk show, so let's do something punk. And like, you just grab what you can. And so we just like, our friends Julie and April like had some spray on dye, so they sprayed it in our hair and like rubber bands in our hair. And then we like borrowed her sister's fairy wings. And like, it was just like early on, like even like playing with like gender norms and gender swapping and all this stuff. But it was just like at a punk show, at a church, at a thing. And like, if you looked at us, you'd be like, that's super performative because it's just spray on hair dye. It's just a costume that you can take off. But like at the moment, it was like, no, this is like, finally I'm able to do this thing. And it was performative, absolutely, but it was also like completely real, completely authentic.
Sure.
And like, I'm a big fan of like the more, you were talking about like the sincerity movement, and I'm a huge fan of like the new sincerity movement. In Russian literature, there's a lot of discussion around like new sincerity, where it's like the idea of like, I don't watch kids cartoons because it's ironic, and I'm not wearing a SpongeBob t-shirt because it's like, look how ironic I am. It's because I fucking love SpongeBob, right? Like, and I think that has a lot to do with it, where it was just like, I could finally go explore that space that I wasn't normally able to. And then like, I think I talked about this a little bit in the email, but like was able to be like, because we were the crate diving kids, and because we were the kids who like would skip over the majority of the stack of records and go to like the weird little corner spot where there was like all the Maranatha record stuff, and then there was like a small drawer of Tooth and Nail stuff. Like,
yes,
I think even just like that psychology of going to the edge of where the records are, or going to the back of the liner notes, like early on developed this like theology and culture of like going to the edge, like even like geographically, you know, like there would be like the big Christian music festivals, and like the punk band would be like in the back tent over in the corner, you know what I mean? Like there was this like thing of like, we'll make room for it, but it's at the margins. And I think for a lot of us kids, like growing up, started to be like, well, we're finding our identity at the margins. And then there, theologically, socially, culturally, it's really easy to then look over the fence to be like, okay, I'm into this punk band, like I'm into One Bag Pig, and I'm into like Lust Control, but like that's really shallow, and there's not really much more because their lyrics are shit and basic, and as long as you're telling me not to masturbate. But like, then I'm like gonna go like, but my other friend at school who dresses kind of similarly, who's also the margins into Crass and Fugazi, like the Venn diagram's already overlapped, and then it's easy for me to look into that, right? And it's like this thing of like, I sometimes think that evangelicalism sows the seeds of its own destruction, because it will like encourage people to like I grew up super into apologetics. And so it was like study and read, learn philosophy, learn rationalism, and then you use it against itself. But you pursue that to a certain end, and then you're like, I'm going to keep reading, and I've now learned enough that all the rest of that shit, that's all bullshit, right? Like, and so it's just like this like culture of being like, we're at the punk show with the kids who look kind of weird and don't fit in, and then when I'm at school, I want to be around the kids who are weird and don't fit in. So then all of a sudden I'm hanging out with the queer kids and the drama nerds and the immigrants and the like Mexican kids who are into Morrissey, and like
Yeah.
we're all kind of learning each other's story. And then I was like, there's a lot more commonality of us weirdos than there is that like I'm finding in the church, who's telling
Right.
me that like all of these people don't belong. But that's like where I found myself,
Yeah. And I think what I'm trying to pick out, I totally agree with that. And like, I think, I'm a socialist. I've been a member of the DSA for like 10 years. I became a leftist eventually. So this thing that I'm trying to describe, like, also didn't happen to me. I mean, maybe when I was like 19, I felt this way, but I think what I'm trying to pick out is that like what you're talking about in terms of the margins. I think that there did emerge a sort of, I don't know if I want to call it disingenuous, but I think Mars Hill is a very good example of this, where Driscoll, to call himself like the bad boy of Calvinism was to try to paint himself as being sort of on the margins of something, when, I mean, in reality, he was pretty mainstream, obviously, like supported by John Piper and, like Acts 29, all that stuff. But his sort of public facing persona was, I'm the bad boy. I'm going to go on Loveline and, take calls about weird sex stuff and, show the world that like, I'm going to cuss. I'm the cussing pastor. Like, so there's a way of embracing, I mean, maybe we want to call it like the aesthetic of the margins or something like that, that actually has nothing to do with people who are really on the margins. And I think that what that eventually morphs into is this sort of almost compulsion to like avoid siding with like a group of people on some issue. So a lot of people are interested in socialism now, like more people are interested in socialism because of Bernie Sanders and whatever. And so maybe I'm going to look at that and be like, oh, I'm not going to follow the crowd. Like I'm going to stay on the margins of, you know what I mean? When it's like not really the margin, but it's just this sort of like reconceptualization of where the margins are. I mean, and I think that that's true of a lot of Christianity in general, right? The idea of persecution complexes and like, recasting yourself as the persecuted minority when you are anything but that, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's part of that whole same mindset in a way. And that's something that I'm, just kind of thinking out loud right now about. I haven't yet done like the necessary academic work to really make that argument fly, but that's what I was kind of thinking about as you were talking about that. Yeah.
Something that Andrew and I point to a lot on the show is like, there are different paths that the scene pointed folks down in terms of their social, political, spiritual development. But the thing that made us want to do a podcast about MXPX and Five Iron Frenzy were that they felt that they were the kind of bands that were giving us permission to question the church and society.
Yeah.
And that felt like a pretty small Venn diagram. I mean, there are a fair amount of bands that we've covered that have come up to that line sometimes, but I think that was what felt freeing to me as a kid who was like trying to find an identity, was the idea that there are spaces where it's okay to question capitalism as well as legalism within the church, and there are different avenues that different bands have used more effectively than others maybe. But I think those Five Iron specifically in terms of sort of like political development was really big for us in terms of sort of
totally
shaping a sort of moral identity.
Still blows me away that they had a song in 1998 about settler colonialism and like Native American massacres. I mean, I don't think I realized that when I was 16, but like looking back, I'm like, oh my God, that's crazy.
Yeah.
That
first song on their debut album talking about Native American genocide,
Yes, exactly.
That's hard. That's hard as fuck. You're going hard. You're not screwing around.
Yeah. And that was, I think that's, we talk a lot about the aspects of some of these lyrics that we're going over, like you guys are saying, that are problematic and maybe that we might have bumped on a little bit growing up, but maybe didn't present it as like a major issue. And now we look back at it and we're like, oh, this is grounds for trauma development here. But there's a lot that we look back on.
Like Five Iron was like immediately a band that I was like, yes, this, because of like those darker tones. But then it was also like Jurassic Park came out when I was 14. Right? 94 or 90?
93.
93, yeah.
93. So I was 13 years old, which was like, and I'll connect the dots here in a second.
I can't wait.
Well,
I'm ready for I'm on board with this journey.
Jurassic Park was like, I was 13 years old. It was rated PG-13. So I was like, it came out right at the time that I was able to be like, I'm able to go see this movie on my own, right? Like finally I'm seeing an adult movie, but it's about dinosaurs. So like it's a movie for kids because like 9, 10, 12-year-old boys are super into dinosaurs as like a traditional, I'm sure lots of other, I'm speaking from my context, lots of people are into dinosaurs. But like, it was like a movie about dinosaurs, which is like for kids, but I was 13 and it's an adult movie and there's like some cursing in it. So it's just like, this is like just enough adult where I feel like really, really mature. And it's just enough kid where it still feels really, really safe. And it's not scary, but there's enough scary where I was just like stepping into that adulthood, and Jurassic Park like pushed me into that. Right. Yeah. Like I was like, yes. And then I went and saw it like 4 times the opening weekend with my friends. And then I went and saw it with my dad and just was like this huge thing. Five Iron Frenzy is similar because there's like, we're going to treat you with maturity and we're going to talk about some heavy stuff. And then we're going to sing a song about our comb, you know? Like,
yeah.
But we can talk about genocide, but then we're also going to be goofy where like, you can still be a goofy kid and just want to skank at their show and like, but also feel a little bit more mature. And then there was like a really short hop, skip, and a jump where I was just like, became way more into the Dingies, and the Dingies were like even further, like unabashed leftists.
Yeah.
Like at the time who are like, all of a sudden, this is where like my, like Bible Answer Man apologetics brain started kicking in, where I'm like reading the notes, trying to interrogate it and reading about like their references to the Bilderbergs or trying to understand why they're talking this way about Ronald Reagan. And then like looking all of that stuff up, and like it was like this Pandora's box, right? Like, and it was like right at that age where we were still kids and we just wanted to go to shows, but we also wanted to be really mature. And these bands were like similar to Jurassic Park. We're like, here's some hints at this stuff. Yeah. Start digging into it and start looking. But you can also be goofy and just bounce around with your friends and sing about your comb, you know? And I think that was like super crucial for that age, where somebody now, you would go give them some of those lyrics or those albums and they'd be like, I'm not picking up why this is so crucial for you. Why it's not such a crucial conspiracy.
Right.
I honestly
album reference.
Yeah, I was like, I know it's in there somewhere.
No, I just want to shout out the Dingies. I don't think the Dingies get enough love in the scene in general, especially in the ska scene in general. They fucking rule. Like Armageddon Massive, Sundown to Midnight. These
great albums.
They're so good. They still hold up. Like, like I only have a handful of actual CDs in my car, and 2 of them are Dingy CDs because it's just fucking rule. So
that was the music that my wife and I could agree on. Like that was our like getting ready to go downtown to protest in Portland in summer 2020. We were like the Dingies. Yeah.
Hell yeah.
That's awesome. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, like even just like we're talking about that, like I remember being like talking a ton about why Dave Chevalier would leave the Supertones to go to this punk band, right? Like he was in the Supertones. They were huge. And then all of a sudden, like he leaves at their height and then goes to join this band called the Dingies that like at the time weren't as big.
Yeah.
And we were like, what the heck? I think that would be a ripe thing to dig into more of, just like, you know, the ministry talking about that stuff. Like I've tried to find him and like pick his brain and be like, what the heck was that all about? But like, because the Supertones were again, that band who like, what you see is what you get. Their lyrics are very simple.
Yeah.
Loud and clear.
They're worship songs, but
Nailed
you
it.
can't dig into it.
Nailed
What
it.
was it?
He said they're loud and clear.
They but there's nothing to like dig into, right? Like you can't scratch
Right.
below the surface.
Yeah.
So like you listen to it the first time, you're like, that's fun, but it doesn't have that like staying power.
No,
Whereas
that you Upbeats and Beatdowns by Five Iron compared to the Adventures of the OC Supertones, those debut albums.
Yeah.
Oh my God. It's
and then,
Adventures
you
of the
take
OC
that
Supertones.
Supertones-
I loved that record when it came out. But when I listen to it now compared to Five Iron, it's like it just doesn't hold up. It's pretty cringy. And this kind of goes to like, you know, you talk about what is the point of your band? Are you a quote? This is always the conversation, like, because you know, Joel, I think it was you that you were talking about like the whole like are you the performative nature of things, or how authentic is it? Are you just in a punk band, or are you are you Mojo in the Supertones, and you're like, this is your ministry, and you're trying to convert, and you're like, and sometimes it's just like, I just kind of want to play some punk songs, or I just want to play some ska songs, and like, I don't need to get up on stage for, you know, between sets to like preach, you know. And I think that's where you kind of get the people making fun of the scene, because there were those people who were being their authentic selves. They're like, I'm using this my time in the height of my of being this popular band. I'm going to use this to talk about the Lord. And then there are people that are just like, oh, I just want you to play some ska songs. I just want you to play some. Yeah. I just want to skank or get in the mosh pit, and you're talking to me about Jesus. I don't want this.
I wonder, like, thinking about those two paths, like the bands that were like, we're just Christians playing music, and like we're a Christian band and we're trying to evangelize.
We're a ministry.
Yes. Yeah, it seems like both of those end up in the same place to me, in terms of like political leanings at the end of the day. Not always, but like both different shades of being apolitical, like in terms of like, you know, Matt Merginsky becoming a pastor. He's probably the pastor that's going to be like, we're not going to talk about George Floyd this Sunday, we're going to talk about Jesus, right? But then you also have like this authenticity piece as well, of like, well, I'm not going to like be political because you know, I'm my authentic self. That it seems like both of those paths lead to a disengagement. Am I like an oppressive disengagement?
It's, you know, because this kind of goes to the deconstruction evangelical movement that we have seen within the alternative Christian scene, and not just alternative, but like some big names, former names within the CCM arena, like Derek Webb and Kevin Max, who was in DC Talk, right, and Dave Bazan of Pedro the Lion, and members of Under Oath who have said that they've never felt more alone than when the times when they were a Christian, and just feeling so isolated. And you know, like, because this to me feels like authenticity. Like when I think of authenticity, I think of people sharing about their trauma, sharing about not just like talking about like, oh, the church is bad, but like getting kind of personal and talking about ways that they've individually fucked up or made mistakes, but also just that using their platform to kind of talk about their experiences in the church. And I'm curious, I'm not sure who has thoughts on this particular shift in the scene, or if you think this is just kind of a blip, if this will go away, or if this is, if there will be more artists to come that are going to be part of this like evangelical or deconstructed Christian artist scene, because there's even more. That's just like an example. I think there was somebody, was it Hawk Nelson?
Hawk Nelson.
Yeah.
And then Trey Pearson was
Yes.
with
A while
Everyday
ago,
Sunday.
Yes.
I mean, that was a while ago, but like even more mainstream than
I think that
Skillet, the lead singer of Skillet's gonna save them all and bring them back.
Okay, that guy is in. I guarantee you, he's got some skeletons. He's into some kinky shit. Like guaranteed, his lyrics are like,
about domination.
Yeah, like S&M kind of shit. Like, all right, guy. All right, we're not kink shaming anybody, but like, don't like come out here and start talking about like Black women and their sexuality when you've got some shit of your own that you're like, just saying.
I think CCM is just sort of like built exactly for this kind of thing to happen, because you have all of these restrictions on artists and what they can and can't do,
right?
At shows, like if they smoke or whatever, like you can't do all of this stuff around the kids, right? Because someone will complain or whatever. There's a money-making machine that has to be maintained. And I think that's just, I mean, people just aren't like that, right? People can't, aren't really built to do that long term. And so I think that there's going to be more people. And also, so there are so many people in CCM who are not Christians and never have been Christians,
right?
Who are good musicians and this is their job and they make a lot of money playing in these bands. I'm not saying like, the major artists like necessarily, but certainly a lot of people in the CCM industry are not Christians at all. So, but yeah, I think that the way that CCM is structured in terms of all the restrictions that it places on its artists in terms of behavior and what they can say or not say, it's like, a tinderbox waiting to be lit, I feel like.
I think thinking about Christian publishing, which is something that I am connected to personally and through my wife, there is this democratization that is happening with Twitter, right? That there is more, there's less gatekeeping, and at the same time, people are finding themselves in this place of searching for the middle, right? So like, so on some level, like there are people that are like in Christian publishing that are talking about being affirming, and as an example, and then there's also a lot of people that are like, well, I don't hate gay people, and so I've come really far, and my church that I grew up in hated gay people, but I don't affirm same-sex marriage, so I'm right where Jesus is. And I don't know how much that parallels with CCM, but it just feels like on some level there is a shift, like they're not able to, the industry isn't able to keep such a tight a tight like leash on these boundaries as much as before, I would say. And at the same time, like the needle is moving really slowly. So
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on this in particular, Jake, because of your tooth and nail background. But one thing we talk a lot about on the show too is like that there was this such distinct scene when we were growing up. There was a whole world of it, and today, much less. I mean, it's easy to talk about, as we're saying, there's a CCM that exists, but as far as like a whole alternate Christian music world and subculture and festivals and labels and
Right.
the charts of comparisons, that's gone. And so
I think
kids
that's
growing
really,
up today. Yeah. Go ahead.
I think that's super crucial and a really amazing double-edged sword, right? Number one, we don't have these like powerhouse publishing companies that everything has to go through, where there's literally was a gatekeeper to be like, to Brandon Ebel scraped out a little niche, was able to be like, but it's Christian enough. And a lot of these early bands, he'd have the Supertones to be like, look at all the ministry we're doing, and then he'd be like, and then putting out behind the scenes like this Pedro the Lion record, right? That like wasn't making enough, but that was great, the great music. But it was like the distributors, like Diamante, there was like Diamante like distribution and like one or two others, and like they could shut stuff down or make and break you. And then like the Christian, in order for me to get the music, I had to go to the Christian bookstore in order to get it. If the person who owned that Christian bookstore or the church was like, we're not going to order it and we're not going to be okay with you ordering, like you couldn't get it. Like our entire town would be like not be able to get that stuff because one dude listened to an episode about Dr. Dobson talking about something, and all of a sudden like it would be gone off the shelves, right? Like there really was a pipeline and it was really easy to control. Now with the internet and like all of those publishing companies have lost their power, distribution is now in the hands of artists way more. Number one, they're not able, artists aren't able to like make a bunch of money on it, but it is more democratized, like Crispin was talking about, which is then like why you have these amazing stories of somebody like Grace Baldridge or similar, like charting on the Christian records with like a completely like centering like the experience of a queer woman, writing about all of this like stuff and attacking it and being able to be like, I'm going to game the system and I'm going to put whatever Christian and inspirational on it. And all of a sudden I'm on those charts, right? Like, because we can do that. And so we can start to like fuck with the system, start to play with it. People can start to listen to it. So many people now are like on Spotify being like, oh, what are the other recommended artists? And we can easily game that. And people are able to like, they don't have to send off for a mail order catalog, get that 2 weeks later, scrape together $10 to buy one album, send for it, wait 2 weeks, then they've got it. And then it like, like we can really push the limits and people can really do that. And that's the same thing with like the internet and so many other tools and publishing, and people can just be like Joel, like you're talking about being like, yeah, I'm working with this other kind of non-traditional publisher to start getting this stuff out, where like 20 years ago, like that would have been completely unheard of and largely impossible to do without some sort of like major backing of the ministry. So I think it's amazing and it's great. And at the same time, there's the double-edged sword of like, you can find your niche on the internet, which I think is great, but it also means that people like Sean Foyt can find his niche on the internet and enable like white nationalist violence and make a ton of money. And he's able to kind of do it under the radar because how many albums is he selling? We don't know because it's all through Apple and they don't publish their charts. So we don't know how much money he's making. We can't track a lot of that stuff. Dark money is like in the Christian music industry is real and it's being hijacked by the far right to like mobilize a lot of this stuff. And so, while it's a right place for people to bring a new message and for the people who haven't had a voice for a long time to finally be able to have a voice, we're also starting to wrestle with the fact that some people, we don't want to have a voice because they're assholes and they're Nazis. And like, they've been able to find their little circle and grow a platform. And so, you know, we have that double-edged sword, and now the community's trying to go, how do we police that? Should we?
Yeah, I think another
you know,
piece of
so-
this that maybe is like part of this conversation, maybe not, but we have to acknowledge that in the early 2000s, all CCM just became worship music.
Right.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so I don't know like how that exactly impacted Tooth and Nail, but you know, in alternative music, but I think it did. I don't even know what kids do now if they're like, I want a band that sounds like Imagine Dragons. Like they just have to find the worship band that sounds the most like Imagine Dragons. Whereas like in the 90s, like the copycat God rock thing was bad, but it also was like, at least it wasn't just like not everybody just like singing worship songs that really like they're even like say DC Talk, right? I'm not alternative at all. Well, whatever. Right, like there's at least some like poeticism and lyricism that they're trying to do versus like putting you know Bible verses in a song.
Yeah.
Right, and there was also some differentiation among genre. I mean, every single worship song is like some like post rock, like heavy reverb, like you know, quiet loud, yeah, lots of builds. It's the same thing over and over again. It's
repetition.
Yeah.
And,
I mean, that's sorry. Go ahead, Andrew.
No, I was just gonna say, and the most important thing is that you know DC Talk loves rap music. They always have, and they always will.
As well.
And there's no other kind of music in the world that makes
me feel
feel
quite as ill.
I mean, like I don't feel quite as ill with
Just
other
personally.
Me personally, I don't feel quite as ill with other kinds of music, but rap music, you know.
I'm glad you made that point.
good point.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of our whole like podcast philosophy is like this scene. There was plenty to pick apart and to look back on in ways that shaped lots of people in negative ways, but there was also a real specialness to it, and
Absolutely.
the music was good, and it still is good. A lot of what we're looking back on, and the specialness of having that kind of world, you know, with its pluses and minuses, is gone now, and I'm sure that still exists, but it was a special moment for a lot of us in really formative ways. And you know, we were talking about artists like. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was interrupting. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say we're talking about like Semler and folks like that today who are sort of looking back on that time as well and making art of it today that you know is charting in Christian charts, but is also obviously appealing to folks outside of that world. So you know, Crispin, I'm interested in your sort of lens on that development as people are looking back on that time as being a formative one. You know, how have you experienced the scene sort of shaping people psychologically, spiritually, as they're sort of moving away from that time and thinking about how that evangelical subculture kind of shaped them?
Yeah, I think in you know, I mostly am just speaking to my experience in friends that are, you know, my same age, but I'm pretty sure that like Christian hardcore, post-hardcore, like Solid State, I'm pretty sure they did so well because of the invention of internet pornography.
Go on.
You know, you have the late 90s, you have a bunch of Christian kids that can look at naked pictures on the internet, feel terrible about themselves. And then you have right, and they're like obviously like lots of themes throughout Christian hardcore and a lot of like battle sort of stuff, and I didn't really investigate that so much, but
every man's battle, if you will.
Right, exactly.
There you go.
But yeah, I mean, you know, like it just, to me, it felt, you know, there are definitely some bands that fell outside that, but especially as you hit that like screamo post-hardcore like era, it's just like everything seemed to be about like how I keep on looking at porn and I can't stop, and I feel so bad about myself. So
I mean, for real, you know, it's funny, like somebody today, so we have a Patreon only Discord, and someone today brought up Triple X Church. Do you
Oh
do,
my
do,
God.
do you guys
Yeah.
remember that?
Forgot about that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
I had blocked that out. Like I had suppressed that.
Mhm.
I was
I had literally not thought about that for 15 years, maybe. I don't know. But
Pastor Gross.
is that something that you're, how familiar are you with that quote unquote ministry?
deeply
Take it away, Jake.
hard into it.
How hard are you into it?
No, I mean, it was, yeah, that was like, I actually worked for, after I was working for Tooth and Nail, I was one of the first staff members for To Write Love on Her Arms,
Okay.
if you're familiar with that organization.
Yeah.
And for like the first year or two, To Write Love had its nonprofit status, was under Fireproof Ministries, which was the like parent company ran by the dudes from Triple X Church. So we were like a supported ministry alongside them and a lot of their ministries. So we were like connecting with Craig and all of the work that they were doing, and you know, deeply at the time, you know, had the software, the accountability software on my computer with my buds, you know, like, and was stoked on what they were doing. But now I'm just like adding that to the list of things that I'm shedding. The amount of all, you know, all of the shame and stuff that I've brought, and you know, that's a whole world. Crispin's completely right. Like so much of that angst, and I think that's like we were talking about Mars Hill and that group of bands like 90 Pound Wuss, Jeff Betger, who went on to do like Suffering and the Hideous Thieves, who like Jeff has become like a friend, amazing dude. Like Suffering and the Hideous Thieves, those records are phenomenal. Like Matt Johnson from Roadside Monument, like all the Roadside Monument dudes. Matt Johnson became a worship pastor at Mars Hill. Even what's his face? My brain turned off.
Dustin Kensrew,
like, you know, has since like is just deconstructing a lot of that stuff. But
yeah.
I think Mark Driscoll was able to like really tap into like, you listen to like early 90 Pound Wuss, you listen to Roadside Monument, like their first record, the first song is called Sperm Ridden Burden. Like
Right,
there's some deep angst
Yeah.
about like this stuff that's going on. And you know, all of this stuff is just like, I'm angry, I'm freaking out. Like, where do I point this stuff out? And like, where do I take this out on? And then Mark comes along and is like, oh no, like you can blame those people, like, and is able to like harness that energy into being like, no, it's the world's fault or it's women's fault. The reason you're mad at women isn't because of the deep misogyny that is inherent in our religion, but it's like because women dress like that, so we can shame them, and we can like harness your shame and point it in a direction and use it for a ministry, right?
That's really interesting because I've thought about how punk is basically like fuck the world, right? Like that's where all the anger goes, is outward, right? But in a Christian context, it can go outward, as we've seen, but it can also go inward, especially if you're like a 13-year-old boy, right?
Well, I think that's the nature of it, right? Is like the church and the faith will teach you like, it's the similar thing of like, fuck the world, it's the world's fault. There's like literally a Christian brand of clothing called Not of This World, right? Like we were taught that all along. Like, I'm not of this world. This is why we have this like apolitical theology, right? Like, oh, I don't need to be involved in politics because I'm a part of, you know, I'm not of this world, so I don't get involved in that.
Right.
But then like that's where that fundamental disconnect and that angst comes from, as like, because like, no, you are of this world, right? Like we are a part of the community, like our actions impact other people. And so that like turning inward anger upon ourselves is also a part of the anger at others, because like we are told to like not find ourselves in community.
And so I mean, also what's interesting about what I find in these Christian hardcore songs is like, it's not my impact on others, it's my impact on God, right? Like there's like this Hex Stoll song about temptation, and it says like, do I dare repent again? Like, how much more of this can you take? Like, as though like, yeah, I'm really, but I mean, Supertones reference, right? Like, every time I sin, I know I reel another nail straight into the cross of Jesus. Remember that one?
Yeah.
You know, like that's like, it's like I can't even, it's not like, oh, like, and it's not even like this, like, oh, I'm hurting someone else and therefore I'm hurting God because God cares about this other person.
Right.
It's just me and God. And so if I sin, like, God's feelings are hurt.
I mean, we
Every
talked
time
about
you masturbate, God kills a kitten.
There you go.
yeah.
See, that would make
I've-
more
I've-
sense to me.
I've
Like-
killed so many kittens.
Are you going to talk about Dogwood right now?
I'm going to talk about Dogwood right now.
Please do.
You know, so my most difficult stretch this season was when we covered Dogwood, because I felt, I'm not sure how familiar you all are with Dogwood, but I felt
Conquerors.
I felt
That's right.
especially like triggered a lot by a lot of the songs, primarily because of how hard Josh was on himself. It was just another one of those album after album of just like, and yeah, he didn't write every single song, but like a lot of the songs were just so down on yourself, and like, and I, coming out of my faith, like I've struggled with a lot of self-hatred, and so many bands, like looking back on a lot of these songs and a lot of these records and a lot of these bands, just like, oh my God, you guys, why do you you just like are just so down on yourselves all the time? But there's a Dogwood song, and I'm forgetting the name of the song, but it opens with, I killed the Son of God today. I drove the nails into,
I built the cross where he was slain.
I built the cross where he was slain. And it's just like, okay, calm down. Just calm down. It's so dramatic. It's so over the top. And it's that like, and it's that same sort of idea. Like I'm jerking off. I feel so bad. And like a lot of these songs that are like, of these young kids that are talking about how terrible they are, they don't really say why they're so terrible, but in my mind, it's always like, you're jerking off and you feel bad about it. And it's like, that's why you're so terrible. It's like, you're not, guys. Come on. It sucks. I was there too, and it sucks. And I hated it so much that this is what a lot of these young dudes were wrestling with, because it's the most natural thing in the world. But like, if you're thinking like, I'm jerking off and because of that, I killed the Son of God.
Yeah.
You know, it's just,
It's a tough one.
It's tough, and it's such a bummer. And yeah, it's way too dramatic.
Yeah. I mean,
well,
go ahead.
I was gonna say that you know, there are lots of reasons why that is, but from an attachment perspective, we want to be close to God, right? If for nothing else, to get to heaven.
Sure.
And so there's that piece, but it's like, yeah, no, actually, I want to be close to God. I'm a Christian, right? And it feels like my sin keeps me away from God, which doesn't really fit with the biblical narrative, because people keep like sinning and killing people and then God shows up. But anyway, that's what you're taught, right? Is like, there's this thing about me that I'm doing that's keeping me away from God, and I can't stop doing it, but at least I can like show God how sorry I am, and I can do that in a really dramatic way. And long before Tooth and Nail, Paul Tillich, there's in my book, I quote him talking about how like, when it feels like we can't contribute anything positive to getting close to God, then at least we can contribute something negative. So he says, you know, the pain of self-accusation and self-rejection. Right. So we're trying to tell God, like, please come near to me. Look at how sorry I am. Look at how terrible I am. So it actually is this way of trying to get this connection with God, especially as a teenager, right? I wouldn't even say especially. You do it dramatically as a teenager, but I'm sure that I think eventually you just give up, right? You're like, I'm just going to keep doing this. I am going to be far from God. I can't really hope for that anymore. But when you're like 14, 15, 16, like maybe I can, you know, say like express myself dramatically enough to show God that I'm sorry. So God will come close to me.
I also think that there's you know, to bring this back to the authenticity piece a little bit. I also think that there's a sense, or maybe wonder, I guess, if there's a sense in which, like, you know, this is not something that, like, I mean, it was sort of edgy, right, in the 90s, like even in youth group and stuff, like when the guys and the girls went in their separate rooms and like, you know, whatever, it was like edgy to be talking about this kind of thing. And so I think that is sort of part of it too, like this expression of like, this is me being an authentic Christian. I'm just being real with God, and I'm putting it out there for everyone to know my shame that I jerked off and it made God sad, right? And it is, you're right, that it is like super heavy, but I think that in a sense it's like, well, that's, you know, the drama is part of the point of it, right? It's part of like laying yourself bare, right, to say like, this is what it means to be like an authentic Christian, to like no longer hide this stuff, right? You know, because we come from this Puritan background or whatever, we don't talk about sexuality or, you know, any of this.
Well, Joel, you were talking about the authenticity, which made me think of you know, I'm working on an episode right now on Me Without You, and obviously like
the most authentic band on Tooth and Nail.
Exactly, right. Shifting
like, not
from,
even a
like,
question,
right? Yeah, shifting from like Under Oath being like, I keep on failing every day, to like, I was looking down her dress, right? Like, I'm gonna be super concrete about these things.
Yes.
Yeah, they're a band that we hope to get to in some capacity someday, but you know, they contain multitudes.
I know, right? I didn't want to even, like, people are like, are you gonna talk about them? And I love Me Without You, and they also don't, you know, like, if you know anything about Me Without You, you realize like, okay, we were interpreting what they were saying from this evangelical lens, but like, that's not where Aaron was operating from.
Nope.
And so
yeah, he's referencing Rumi and all these other things that have nothing to do with evangelicalism.
Yeah.
But
we knew where we tried to interpret it.
I mean, do y'all remember how like shocked some people were with the end of It's All Crazy being a song called Allah, Allah, Allah?
Right.
And like people kind of losing their minds about that. It's like, I mean, it just means God in Arabic. It doesn't, you know. But yeah, that was kind of nuts.
Yeah, that kind of, I mean, that makes me think of, we've talked about, you know, circles where a left-leaning punk ethos had an impact in the Christian world, other circles where it was repurposed for conservative impact. I mean, are there specific bands or sort of movements within the church, I mean, that either of you, but you know, especially you, Joel, with your academic work on it, like, that you can point to as far as like, these bands or this kind of thinking had an influence here, and you can kind of tell the obvious paths that were shaped from them?
I think a little bit. I mean, something that is just endemic to Christianity is, unfortunately, I think, you know, the nature of kind of like this colonial impulse, right, to just colonize and make something about you and for you, even if it's not. And that happens, I think, you know, on large and small scales. So, you know, bands that like very clearly have a left-leaning ethos, people, you know, fans who are conservative just found a way to like ignore that or say, no, they don't. when they obviously do. So in terms of like conservative, I hope none of you are Project 86 fans.
We've discussed this on the show a little bit.
What the fuck is going on?
I know. I can't like
what has happened? I don't understand what has happened.
It's crazy. I know. I was never really a Project 86 fan myself. I just kind of felt like I didn't like new metal type sounding stuff, and they were too new metal for me. And,
drawing black lines was like, it was sort of but it wasn't like it wasn't new metal in the way that like, Andrew Schwab wasn't like throwing in like raps during like the bridge or something like that. There weren't like turntables like happening or anything like that. But
it does seem to me that the fans who, my sample size is pretty small. It's just so far like my interviews in these Facebook groups, but it seems like the people who sort of lean more conservative are the ones who like stuff like Project 86, 1,000-Foot Crutch, Cutlass, POD, and maybe some early Solid State stuff like Living Sacrifice or Extol or something like that. But I think that, in terms of people that I've interviewed, like Mark Solomon was my favorite interview by far. That dude is super intense, really, really heady, and thoughtful too. He's obviously, if you follow him on Twitter, he's a super leftist, but still very much like speaks in evangelical language. Like he talked about finding community and like, I just, was still sort of in that world to a certain extent. But yeah, I think that certainly, I mentioned before, like a lot of these early bands like Crash Dog, for instance, which was, a lot of people, like, unless you grew up in that era, I didn't even really know about them until I started researching this book, but they were very left-leaning politically.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, they have a lot of sort of leftist themes in their songs, and even some of like the I think it's the early Squad 5-0 stuff. There's some like there's some stuff in there as well. But yeah, no. In terms of left, I think the point that was made earlier about like MXPX and Five Iron, right? That there was a sense in which they were both authorizing, critique of sort of institutional forms of Christianity, as well as certain aspects of society. I think Teenage Politics, even though, they were teenagers when they wrote that album, I think that there's this interesting like nexus point of like, oh no, this is really like, you can really see how being a Christian punk like really works here, right? Where you're able to, you're critiquing all forms of institutional authority, whether it's society or church. And that really actually works, I think, really well. I
think that was the reason that was like me and Andrew's number one all-timer.
Like literally they have a song that says legalistic people suck, legalism makes me sick.
Yep.
That like that sort of language and Americanism, nationalism, bow to the flagism, these like terms that you didn't hear in other Christian albums. And also like Squad 5-0 talking about the Confederate flag nowadays would probably be like, people would be like, what the fuck are you?
Yeah.
But
you can't be a Christian and say that.
Right. Yeah.
You can't be a Christian and say
Disrespect
racism
the-
is bad.
Yeah.
I mean, wait a second. No, that's not what I'm saying. Wait a second. Shit.
So
Yeah.
I forgot something coming into this conversation, and then I remembered it about half an hour ago. And then I decided I didn't want to share this, which was that like Supertones were like my favorite band until like probably like up through like 16, 17, like even when I was listening to a lot of other stuff.
I thought you were
And
about to say until last year.
until last year, right? Yeah. No, but it's you know, I loved the passion. I loved the dogma of it, you know, like Loud and Clear, which was
Right.
not my favorite album, but like, you know, in fact, that probably was one of the last albums that I listened to from them. But it was, you know, there are these songs about like, you don't read your Bible enough, and you know, we put down the Bible and pick up the PlayStation, and but it is that like that rigid dogma that like has informed my leftist like politics.
Interesting.
You know, so I don't know how much that, I mean, part of that, I don't know if you're familiar with my wife, DL Mayfield, who,
Of course.
yes. So, you know, but that was kind of where it led us, was like, okay, like we're going to be like hardcore for Jesus, which then led us into marginalized communities, which then led us
Sure.
into like an organization that was like, that told us like just serving in a marginalized community isn't enough. You actually have to like learn from and like submit to in a sense, right? Like learning from marginalized people, which, you know, which then that's what led to the deconstruction in terms of like hell, right? Like my wife was like, how, like I would rather we were talking about this recently on our podcast. She's like, I would rather if I get to like the pearly gates and like the refugees I know from Afghanistan are not allowed into heaven, like I'm just gonna go to hell with them. Like, fuck you, God. Like, if that's
Right.
the kind of God you are, like, but like that actually all comes from these like religious convictions that like started with the Supertones.
Yeah. Interesting.
I you know, I don't think a lot of people have a path like that. I mean, the other like parallel path here was going to a Me Without You show and like randomly picking up a documentary about Shane Claiborne because Aaron Weiss had spent time there, and then like finding it 3 years later, and then my wife and I watching it and being like, oh my gosh, we're gonna move from like the suburbs into like this low-income apartment building. So, you know, it's kind of interesting to reflect on the ways that these bands have shaped where we are now. I think you probably have to have both. You know, you have to have it. I'm not saying Shane Claiborne is super radical, but he was then. Like I needed, you know, if it would have just been Supertones, I never would have made it to where I am now.
You needed that irresistible revolution.
I did.
That's right. Yeah. Man, I feel like that's a great note to end on. Just thinking about the impact that the scene had in all kinds of ways for all kinds of people. But you know, we've all arrived at a fairly similar place in terms of our ethos, but it's very different than it was back then, but it still shaped us. And I just find this conversation continuously fascinating, and hearing from folks about the ways in which that led them to where they are now in all kinds of ways. So you've all been very generous with your time. Very excited to continue to read your work and check out what you're doing. Crispin, do you want to let folks know where they can find you and what you're working on?
Yeah, so just, you know, find me on Twitter. And I do have a book coming out called Attached to God, but you know, if you're listening to this, you probably will enjoy my current season called Shamecore Records, where I'm looking at you know, a lot of the music that I loved growing up, and then kind of using that as a launching point to talk about both the emotional experience of growing up in evangelicalism and also its political implications on some level as well. So
Jake, do you want to tell folks where they can find you and anything you're working on that you might want to promote or plug?
yeah, I mean, I'm mostly here in Portland and doing a lot of activism, trying to be involved in our police abolition movement and holding a lot of our elected officials accountable. So you can find me mostly on Twitter, at Jake Dockter, and it's mostly me tweeting about our horrible mayor and trying to get him recalled. And I also am involved in some various like mutual aid organizations, and I serve with a group called the Chemical Weapons Research Consortium. We're working to like ban the use of chemical weapons by law enforcement and study them, try to find out what the stuff is that they're dumping on us, and then try to convince them to not dump it on us anymore. And if people are super interested in that work, could always use some donations because we have to pay for a lot of the studies of that stuff ourselves. And we're also working with some organizations to fund like gas masks and respirators for children who are being gassed by the police. So there's some really great orgs that are doing great work. If somebody is listening in the Portland area and wants to get involved, definitely reach out. I'd love to plug in, and just trying to help out how I can, and being involved in the Black Lives Matter, police abolition, and police brutality movement, ending police brutality movement, and, talking a lot of trash online.
Right on. Thanks, man.
Yeah. Thanks all. Appreciate this conversation. It's been really, really good for me to like get out of my brain for a minute and talk about things that I really love, and in my brain enough, but also to be able to make references to the insiders.
Totally. Yeah. Thank you for getting it going, man. We appreciate it. Joel, for you, where can folks find you, and what work do you want to plug?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter at Prof. J. Harrison. I don't post a ton there because I'm very bad at Twitter, but I am there. Most of my social media time is spent on my Instagram account for my vinyl record collection.
Ooh, shit. I'm
which
listening.
is Underground Vinyl, spelled UNDRGRND _ vinyl. And yeah, that's a lot of fun, actually. That there's this whole like vinyl collector community of people who collect like underground punk vinyl stuff. It's really, really, really fun. It consumes way too much of my time, to be honest. But yeah, I actually am also sort of in the process right now with a couple other guys of starting a podcast about Me Without You.
Ooh.
And I really can't say much more than that at this point.
Okay.
But it's going to be a album by album, song by song sort of breakdown, with me talking about theology and philosophy stuff, another person who's a music expert talking about music, and so yeah, it's going to be really, really good, I hope.
Awesome.
We have
So
some
be on the
Me
lookout for that.
Without You stands that listen to our pod.
Oh, nice.
So
For sure.
Yeah.
yeah.
If you need some special guests, you just hit us up. Really look forward to that. Well, thank you all for your time. We appreciate it so much.
Yeah, thank you too. I really appreciate having
thanks.
this conversation, and the conversations you guys regularly have. It's great.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Legalistic people suck. Legalism makes me sick. I wanna what makes them tick. I wanna go and give a net. Ephesians verse 2:8 states. God has says not by word.
Tell you what I don't want to go puke on is that great conversation we had. Thank you to Krispin, Jake, and Joel. Really enjoyed hearing from all of them. I hope folks go find them doing all the interesting things that they're doing. Grateful to them for spending that time with us this week. Let us know what you think of the conversation at Magnified Pod on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Subscribe if you haven't already, and give us a rating or review. We will read your review on the pod. Email us at magnifiedpod@gmail.com.
You can leave us a voicemail at 872-762-4763, 8727-MAGPOD.
And you can support us at the Patreon, patreon.com/magnifiedpod. And we want to welcome new patron this week, Skeletor's Butthole. I don't know what your real name is, Skeletor's Butthole. That's right. Magpod will never get me. Yes, it brought me great joy to see the name Skeletor's Butthole written out among our new patrons. So thank you very much, Skeletor, for
And your butthole,
supporting
I
us.
guess.
And, yeah, of course. I hope you get He-Man and everybody at Castle Grayskull. You can pick up some merch at magnifiedpod.storyenvy.com. Thanks to shadow producer Jason at Unoriginal Vinyl, and thanks to Heavy Ordnance Studios for our artwork. Andrew, we got a little special announcement in this outro.
Oh shit, John, what's this announcement, bro?
Our time in the penalty box is over for this week. We'll be back out on the ice next week when we'll start discussing Craig's brother.
Oh.
Their album Homecoming.
And 1956, things were changing. The federal government was rearranging. Started to put an end to segregation. Can't do that to our pocket federation. State of Georgia, Southern pride. Raise a new flag, we can defy. They can't tell us what to do. Racist distinction, red, white, blue. How can you justify what they can't deny? The fly our state, a ban of hate. Separate is not equal. Separate is not equal. Separate is not equal. Separate is not equal. 997 and things that change a bit.
Things are about to change.
So good.
For more shows like this one, visit rockcandyrecordings.com.